7 people witnessed what happened inside that gymnasium on the night of March 14th, 1969. 7 people. And not one of them ever spoke about it publicly. Not for years. Not because they were told to stay silent. Not because anyone threatened them. Because they genuinely didn't think anyone would believe them. The man who walked into that gym that evening was wearing a plain white t-shirt, loose trousers, and a pair of worn sneakers. He was lean, almost fragile looking. He couldn't have weighed more than 140 pounds soaking wet. He stood near the back wall, arms folded, watching quietly, the kind of man your eyes skip right over in a crowd. The boxing champion who decided to make an example of him that night stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 218 pounds of trained competitive muscle. He chose the wrong man. He chose Bruce Lee. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Raymond the Hammer Hargrove was and why he believed with absolute certainty that no one in that gym could touch him. Los Angeles, 1969. The city was moving fast. Music was loud. The counterculture was burning on every street corner. And in the underground fighting circuit that ran through the back rooms of West Hollywood, one name carried weight like a thrown refrigerator. Raymond Hargrove. He had 17 consecutive wins in unsanctioned bouts, not amateur sparring, real fights behind closed doors where the only rule was that you stopped when someone couldn't stand. He'd broken a man's jaw in Burbank, dislocated a shoulder in Culver City, put a former Golden Gloves contender on the canvas in under 40 seconds in a parking garage in Van Nuys. He was not a showman, he was a finisher. At 26, Hargrove was being groomed for a professional contract. His trainer, a thick-necked ex-Marine named Dolph Bauer, had been pushing him toward the legitimate circuit for months, but Hargrove liked the underground scene. He liked the fear he saw in men's faces before a fight. He liked walking into a room and watching people move out of his way without him saying a single word. Power was his religion, size was his gospel, and he preached it every chance he got. That particular Thursday evening, Bauer had arranged a private training showcase at the West Side Athletic Club, a mid-tier gymnasium on the edges of Silver Lake that catered to serious fighters and serious money. The idea was simple. Invite a dozen people from the boxing world, let Hargrove spar a few rounds against 2 of Bauer's other fighters, show off the goods, maybe attract an investor or a promoter, create some buzz. About 15 people filtered into the gym that night. Trainers, a couple of semi-professional fighters, a few men in sport coats who looked like they had money to spend. And then, near the back, almost invisible against the far wall beneath the broken clock, stood a young Chinese-American man who had come with one of the trainers as a +1. He wasn't on anyone's guest list. He wasn't supposed to be there. He just happened to be in the neighborhood, happened to be accompanying a friend, happened to step inside. He stood quietly, watched everything, said nothing. His name was Bruce Lee. He was 28 years old. In the mainstream world, he was barely a footnote, a guy who'd had a small role in a TV series called The Green Hornet that had already been canceled, a martial arts instructor who ran a small school out of Culver City, someone the men in sport coats would have looked right past without a second thought. Hargrove noticed him almost immediately. Not because Bruce Lee was doing anything, precisely because he was doing nothing. There's a certain kind of man, and Hargrove was exactly this kind of man, who cannot stand stillness in someone he perceives as beneath him, who reads calm as weakness, who sees composure as an invitation. Hargrove finished his warm-up, rolling his massive shoulders, shadowboxing with casual arrogance in the center of the gym. He glanced at Bruce Lee once, then again. Then he leaned over to Bauer and said something low, and Bauer laughed. One of the other fighters nearby caught part of it. He's looking at the little Chinese guy like he's a dog that wandered in off the street.
The showcase started smoothly enough. Hargrove sparred the first round against a light heavyweight named Torres who had 30 pounds on him and still spent most of the round clinching just to stay upright. Hargrove moved like something mechanical, relentless, calculating, precise. Every punch had mass behind it. Every combination ended with something that made people in the room wince. Between rounds, Hargrove grabbed a towel and walked the perimeter of the gym, showboating, working the room. This was his cathedral, and he was letting everyone know it. He stopped in front of Bruce Lee. He looked him up and down, the same way a man looks at something he can't believe is real. The lean arms, the quiet eyes, the absolute stillness. "You a fighter?" Hargrove asked. The question wasn't genuine. It was a weapon dressed up as a question. Bruce Lee looked at him, didn't move, didn't blink. "I train," he said simply. Hargrove smiled, the smile of a man who has already written the next 5 minutes in his head. "You train," he repeated, louder now, loud enough for the room to hear. "What do you train? Tai Chi? Ping pong?" A few people laughed, not many, but enough. Bruce Lee said nothing. That silence enraged Hargrove more than any comeback could have. He'd been in enough confrontations to know the different kinds of silence. Scared silence flinched at the edges. Uncertain silence looked away. But Bruce Lee's silence had no edges. It was still and deep and completely unbothered, like a stone at the bottom of a river, completely unmoved by the current raging above it. It unnerved Hargrove, and because it unnerved him, he pushed harder. "I've hit heavier men than you," Hargrove said, crossing his arms, "and they didn't get back up." "I know," Bruce Lee said quietly. "I've seen your fights." Hargrove paused. Something shifted in his eyes. "And?" Bruce Lee said, "Your right hand drops after every combination." Not cruelly, observationally, as though he were reading a weather report. 3 inches, every time. The gym went quiet. Not loud quiet, the kind of quiet that seeps in slowly, like cold air under a door. The kind where people stop pretending to look at other things. Bauer straightened up from his position by the ring. Hargrove's jaw tightened. The smile didn't disappear completely, but it hardened, turned into something colder. "Is that right?" "Yes," Bruce Lee said. "You want to show me," Hargrove said. "Right here. You and me. No pads, no gear. Just show me." There was a long beat. Bauer said something under his breath to one of the corner men. Nobody heard what it was. Hargrove walked to the center of the gym like a man walking into his own kingdom. He was half a foot taller than Bruce Lee. He outweighed him nearly 80 pounds. His fists, even loose at his sides, looked like construction equipment. He'd spent 6 years building this body into a weapon. He had no reason, not one scientific or logical reason, to feel anything but total confidence. But something was already wrong, something he couldn't name. Bruce Lee walked to the center and stopped. He stood in a way that was hard to describe to someone who hadn't seen it. Not a classic boxing stance, not a movie pose, just ready, like a loaded mechanism waiting to be triggered. His weight was distributed with the precision of something engineered rather than trained. His hands were at his sides, not raised, not guarding, just present. Hargrove rolled his neck, bounced on the balls of his feet. A habit, a ritual, the thing he always did before he ended someone. "You sure about this? No rules?" Bruce Lee looked at him calmly. "Whenever you're ready," he said. Hargrove threw the first punch. It was a right cross. Textbook. Devastating. The kind of punch that had rearranged the faces of 17 men before this night. It came fast, faster than most people in that gym expected from a man his size. Hargrove wasn't slow. That was the thing people always underestimated about him. He was big and quick, a rare and brutal combination. The punch never landed, not even close. Bruce Lee was no longer where he had been standing. It happened in a fraction of a second, a movement so small, so minimal, that half the room didn't even register it as movement. A slight pivot, a weight shift, a redirection of his entire body along an invisible axis. The fist passed through empty air where his face had been, and Hargrove stumbled forward half a step from the momentum of a punch that hit nothing. 1 second. That was all it took. The room didn't react yet. The room was still processing. Hargrove reset. His eyes darkened. The smile was completely gone now. He'd missed clean, and clean misses did something dangerous to men like Hargrove. They didn't humble them. They ignited them. He came again, faster this time. A jab-cross combination that had dropped the light heavyweight Torres in training just 2 weeks prior. Bruce Lee slipped the jab with a tilt of his head, millimeters of clearance, nothing more, and stepped inside the cross with a movement that should have been impossible at that distance. He was suddenly close, closer than Hargrove expected,
close enough that Hargrove could smell the plain soap on his shirt. And then Bruce Lee hit him. Once, in the ribs. Not a full strike, a controlled one, a message. The sound it made was dense and sharp, not the soft thud of a padded sparring exchange, but something harder, more architectural, like someone striking the load-bearing wall of a building. Hargrove felt it travel through him in a way that punches rarely did, not just at the point of impact, but through him, like the force had somewhere else to be and his body was simply in the way. He took a step back. Not a collapse, not a fall, a step. But in this room, among these people who had watched Hargrove absorb punishment from men twice as dangerous as anyone here, that single backward step was a seismic event. Bauer stood up straight. Nobody spoke. Hargrove's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, anger, and then, the most dangerous thing, pride. Wounded, cornered pride, the kind that makes men stop thinking and start swinging. He came with everything, a flurry, both hands, combinations he'd been drilling for years, muscle memory encoded through thousands of hours of bag work and sparring. He threw punches the way most men breathe, automatically, instinctively, without conscious thought. None of them landed. Bruce Lee moved through the assault like water moving through a broken dam, not blocking, not retreating, simply redirecting. He wasn't absorbing or evading, he was flowing. Each of Hargrove's punches created a geometry of force that Bruce Lee read a half-second before it arrived and stepped through at exactly the angle that made it irrelevant. 3 seconds passed. To the people watching, it felt like watching someone try to hit smoke. Then Bruce Lee stopped moving. He planted his feet. What happened next took less than 1 second, and every single person in that gym would spend years afterwards trying to reconstruct it in the correct sequence, and none of them would ever fully agree on what they saw. Bruce Lee's left hand rose, not in a swing, not a wind-up, barely a motion at all, and struck Hargrove in the chest. The point of contact was precise, center sternum, 2 inches below the collarbone. The strike traveled approximately 8 inches from start to finish. 8 inches. Hargrove left the ground, not dramatically, not like a movie. He went backwards, cleanly, suddenly, completely, the way a heavy door flies open in a strong wind. His heels lifted. His body traveled nearly 4 feet before his back connected with the canvas-covered floor of the gym. He landed flat. He did not immediately get up. The silence that followed was absolute. Not theatrical silence, genuine, stunned, involuntary silence. The kind that descends when the human brain witnesses something that doesn't match any prior category of experience and simply stops generating sound while it tries to process. Bauer had both hands over his mouth. Torres, the light heavyweight who had sparred Hargrove 10 minutes ago, was pressed against the far wall, staring. One of the men in sports coats had stepped backwards without realizing it and bumped into the wall behind him. 7 seconds. That was all it had taken. From the moment Hargrove threw his first punch to the moment he hit the floor. 7 seconds. 7 seconds that reordered every hierarchy in that gymnasium and replaced it with something nobody quite had language for. Hargrove lay on the floor, breathing, chest rising and falling, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't unconscious, he wasn't broken, but he wasn't moving either. He was doing what his body demanded, which was to be still for a moment and take stock of whether everything was still attached. Bruce Lee stood where he had been standing. He hadn't moved from that planted position. His breathing was level. His hands had returned to his sides. He looked down at Hargrove with an expression that held no triumph, no satisfaction, no performance of any kind. He looked like a man who had simply finished a task that needed doing. "Your right hand," Bruce Lee said, quietly, dropped again. He turned, walked back to the wall where he had been standing before any of this began, and folded his arms. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Bauer crossed the gym in 4 long strides and crouched beside Hargrove, checking him with the practiced hands of a man who had seen fighters go down before. Hargrove waved him off, the universal gesture of the proud and stunned. He sat up slowly, looked across the gym at the lean figure standing against the far wall. He said nothing. No challenge, no threat, no demand for explanation. He just looked. And in that look, witnessed by 7 people in a gymnasium in Silver Lake, Los Angeles on a Thursday night in March of 1969, was something rare on the face of Raymond the Hammer Hargrove, something that might have been respect. No footage was ever taken that night. No cameras, no recordings, no official record of any kind. But the 7 people in that room talked, not loudly, not publicly, but in the way people talk when they've seen something they can't explain, in half sentences, in gestures, in that particular tone of voice people use when they want to be believed but aren't sure they deserve to be. Within 2 weeks, the story moved through the underground fighting circuit of West Hollywood and into boxing gyms from Inglewood to Pasadena. The details shifted slightly with each telling, the way all myths do. Some versions said Hargrove went down twice. Some said he never got up at all. Some said Bruce Lee never even raised his voice. Some said he never even changed his expression. That last part was true. By the time the story reached the East Coast, carried there by fighters and trainers and men in sport coats who knew men in other sport coats, it had taken on dimensions that belonged more to legend than to a Thursday night in a mid-tier gymnasium. People who had never met Bruce Lee, never seen him move, never stood in the same room with him were repeating the story in gyms in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago. The thing about myths is that they don't spread because they're exaggerated. They spread because at their core, they're true. Raymond Hargrove continued fighting. He went on to compile a respectable record in the professional circuit over the following years. He became, by any reasonable measure, a successful fighter. He never publicly discussed what happened that night in Silver Lake. Not once. Not in any interview, not in any gym conversation anyone ever overheard. Some silences say more than words.
Here is what most people miss when they tell stories about Bruce Lee. They focus on the speed, the precision, the physical impossibility of a man who weighed 140 pounds generating enough force to move a 218-pound trained fighter through the air. And those things are real, and they are extraordinary, and they deserve to be told, but they are not the point. Bruce Lee spent his entire life arguing, in gyms, in classrooms, in his private journals, in late-night conversations that stretched until the sun came up, that the body is not the source of power. The body is the instrument. The source is something deeper, something that has no weight and no size and no record and no ranking. Awareness, presence, understanding. He wrote in his journals about the concept of being like water, not because water is passive, but because water is adaptive. It has no fixed shape. It cannot be held by force. It finds the precise angle that allows it to move through any obstacle. It does not fight the shape of the container. It becomes the shape of the container. And in doing so, it goes exactly where it intends to go. Hargrove came into that gymnasium with certainty, with size, with a record, with a reputation built on 17 victories over men who were, in every conventional measurement, formidable. Bruce Lee came in with none of those things. He came in with awareness. He had watched Hargrove's fights. He had cataloged the flaw, the right hand that dropped 3 inches after every combination. He had filed it away not as ammunition, not as a plan, but simply as knowledge, understanding, the kind of quiet, patient observation that most men never bother with because they believe force is sufficient. Force is never sufficient. This is what Bruce Lee knew at 28 years old. Knew it in his bones, in his muscles, in the precise calibration of his nervous system that allowed him to move before a punch arrived, to be somewhere else before the threat fully materialized. Size is a fact. Speed is a fact. But understanding, real understanding, the kind that sees through the surface of a thing to its actual structure, that is the rarest fact of all. In the years that followed that Thursday night in Silver Lake, Bruce Lee would become something the world had never quite seen before. He would film Enter the Dragon.
He would change the way the entire planet thought about martial arts, about Asian identity on screen, about what the human body was capable of when trained with absolute philosophical commitment. He would be written about and analyzed and mythologized in 1,000 languages across every continent on Earth. He would die at 32. Young, impossibly young, in a way that felt like the universe making a cruel editorial decision. But here is what the mythmakers and the documentarians and the retrospective analysts sometimes forget. Before the cameras, before the contracts, before the fame and the legacy and the slow-building avalanche of global recognition, there was a young man, standing against a gymnasium wall in Los Angeles, wearing a plain white t-shirt, watching a room full of people look straight through him. There was a champion who chose him as a target because he looked like the easiest person in the room. There was 7 seconds. And there was a silence afterward that 7 witnesses carried in their chests for the rest of their lives. The particular silence of people who have been present at something they cannot explain, something that cracked their understanding of what was possible and let in a cold, bright, humbling light. Bruce Lee never boasted about that night. He never told that story himself, because for him, it wasn't a story. It wasn't a victory to be cataloged or a reputation to be built. It was simply a moment of honest exchange, a question asked with fists and answered with everything he knew. The world is full of men who believe size is armor. Bruce Lee spent his entire life proving that the only real armor is understanding. And by the time most people realize that, by the time the Hargroves of the world are lying on the canvas looking up at a gymnasium ceiling trying to reconstruct the last 7 seconds, the lesson has already been delivered. Quietly, precisely, without a single wasted movement. Just like the man himself. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that the greatest power has never been the loudest one in the room, then you already understand what Bruce Lee spent his whole life teaching. Subscribe, because we tell the stories that history forgot to write down, but never forgot to remember.